We talked about shadow AI on this podcast 2 years ago, and we're talking about it again today because it's still going on, but one company decided to embrace it. We'll tell you all about it in this short midweek episode of For Immediate Release. Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 510 of For Immediate Release. I'm Shel Holtz.
And I'm Neville Hobson. There's a quiet tension playing out inside many organizations right now. On one side, you have leadership teams, IT, legal, compliance, all trying to put structure, governance, and control around how artificial intelligence is used at work. On the other side, you have employees who've already moved on. They're not waiting for official tools. They're not sitting through pilot programs. They're not asking permission. They're opening ChatGPT on their phones. They're using Claude in a browser tab. They're experimenting quietly, often invisibly, finding ways to make their work faster, easier, sometimes better. And in many organizations, this shadow AI behavior is still being treated as a problem, something to restrict, monitor, or shut down. It's a topic Shel and I discussed on this very podcast in episode 419 nearly 2 years ago, and it hasn't gone away. In fact, recent data suggests it's accelerating. A study last November by Black Fog and Sapio Research found that nearly half of employees surveyed in the UK and US are using unsanctioned AI tools. Even more striking, 60% said they would take security risks with those tools if it meant meeting a deadline. So this isn't fringe behavior, it's become normal. An article in the Harvard Business Review this month argues that instead of treating unauthorized AI use as a compliance issue, organizations should see it as a signal, a sign that people are already finding value in these tools, even if the organization hasn't caught up. The article calls this the hidden demand for AI inside your company. And when you look at it through that lens, the picture changes quite dramatically, because instead of asking, how do we stop this, you start asking, what are we missing? The piece goes further than theory. It looks at what one organization actually did when it recognized this dynamic. BBVA, a Spanish multinational financial services company with more than 125,000 employees. Rather than clamping down on shadow AI use, they moved quickly to provide a secure enterprise environment, but more importantly, they didn't try to control everything from the center. They took a different approach. They identified and empowered what they called champions and wizards, the people already experimenting, already curious, already building things. They created a network, a community of practice, a way for ideas, use cases, and practical solutions to spread peer-to-peer across the organization. And the results, at least as reported, are striking. Thousands of employees actively using AI tools, thousands of internally created applications, and measurable time savings, hours per person every week. But perhaps the most interesting part isn't the numbers, it's the philosophy behind it. The idea that successful AI adoption doesn't start with a perfectly designed top-down strategy. It starts by recognizing that innovation is already happening, just not where leadership expects it. So the question becomes, do you try to control that energy, or do you find a way to harness it? And that opens up a much broader conversation, one that goes well beyond technology. It touches on leadership, trust, and culture, on how change actually happens inside organizations. And importantly for communicators, on how you surface, legitimize, and guide behavior that may already be happening under the radar. Because if employees are already using these tools, and most evidence suggests they are, then silence or restriction alone isn't really a strategy, it's a gap. So in this conversation, we want to explore that gap. What shadow AI really tells us about organizations today, whether the BBVA approach is something others can realistically replicate, and where the risks still sit because they have not disappeared. And we should be clear, BBVA may be an outlier. It's a highly data-mature organization with strong leadership alignment. Many organizations don't have that foundation. So the question isn't just whether this works, It's whether it can work anywhere else, and what that means for the future of work and for the role communicators play in shaping that future. Shel?
Well, a few thoughts, starting with the fact that BBVA has the financial resources to provide a secure environment for those tools that employees are using. There are many organizations whose IT budgets are razor thin and don't have those resources, so they would need to figure something else out around this. But yeah, I think there's a caution here worth raising. The numbers from Black Fog are real, even if the framing from the Harvard Business Review is optimistic. 34% of employees using free versions of tools when paid approved versions exist. 58% of unsanctioned users on free tiers with no enterprise protections. The reframing from threat to signal, it doesn't eliminate this exfiltration risk. It reframes how we need to respond to it. Communicators should be careful not to let the BBVA-style narrative become an excuse to ignore governance. Now, the right frame is to harness the demand, don't suppress it, and build the governance at the same time. But using these unsanctioned tools and using them to put secure data and secure company information across it, that's a governance risk. And I don't think we can ignore that. I mean, I think what BBVA did is great. I think they baked it into some governance, looking at a new approach that they could afford to take. But many organizations, governance is still a requirement here inside organizations.
Well, I agree. It's something that's important, and it's not to ignore by any means. I think you fleshed out a little bit the survey that I mentioned, which is actually useful to have that level of detail. But I think the big question for me is this is the picture in many organizations. According to that survey, compared to data previously, this is getting, well, is worse the right word, is happening more frequently, that people are just going ahead and using what works for them as opposed to what's the official thing. What is that? A symptom, maybe? A lack of trust? What is it, I wonder? It's probably a mix of things as to why people would do that. Yet, to me, it's like the communicator's role here, it seems to me, is to try and help people, on the one hand, understand what the tools can do for them, and on the other hand, to help the organization understand that, look, we need to address this issue. People aren't using the approved ones; they're doing stuff on their own, and that isn't something that's good. You mentioned security risks. The Harvard article goes into some detail about that, as indeed does the people who did that survey. You can just picture the severe risk of that, and we've seen examples in recent months of organizations that have suffered from unauthorized use of unapproved software tools, not necessarily generative AI tools, but software certainly, and it's a big deal. So I think the question: do you try to control all this and look at ways to stop it? We asked this very question 2 years ago in our conversation. And we could probably just insert the recording from then and replay the answer, but let's talk about it. So I don't think they should try and stop it. Personally, I think that's a fail. There's no win in that at all. Certainly not for the organization. So how would communicators go about that, do you think?
Well, and I'm not suggesting that organizations crack down on this and become, Big Brother looking at the tools that people are using, especially when they're using them, say, on their personal phones or on their personal laptops. But there's definitely things that communicators can do here. The first is to surface and amplify the internal use cases, not just looking at the fact that the people are using these tools, but what are they using them for? When the security people and the legal people find out that this is actually driving the effective work product from these employees, I think there might be more appetite for figuring out a way to bake this into the governance documents, the governance policies that the organization has established. And I think giving employees permission narratives, telling them it's safe to experiment, letting them know how to do it, and suggesting where the guardrails are. So, if you are using shadow AI, here are things to be careful about. Let them know what the risks are and how to avoid falling into those traps. I think communicators can also translate the IT and legal guardrails into plain language that doesn't read as prohibition, because that's just going to, lead to some negative thoughts from employees about the organization, and then they'll just continue using what they're using. And then I think, collecting and routing the demand signal back to leadership. Why are employees using these when there are approved tools around? What are the advantages? So that leadership can make investment decisions that match the patterns of usage that employees are engaged in. So I think there's a lot of work here for communicators that goes beyond simply saying, don't do this.
Yeah, agree. And in fact, you can learn from much of what BBVA did, even if you're not an organization with the established foundation and 125,000 employees. They did things that most companies aren't going to be able to do. For instance, they reached an agreement with OpenAI and deployed a kind of a customized version of ChatGPT Enterprise in a secured, exclusive cloud just for the company. And that the reason's interesting. What the Harvard Review report, Shel, they say the strategic decision was clear. It was more dangerous to have unmanaged hidden AI usage than to rapidly deploy a managed secure solution that aligned with existing needs. Okay, so most companies aren't going to be able to do that. So that therefore comes back to perhaps what you've just proposed, i.e. explaining to people the pros and cons, the risks and so forth. But I think you need to kind of more than that too. Otherwise, you're going to have significant numbers of people who are going to ignore that and just go ahead anyway with what they've been doing. So maybe elements of what BBVA did, for instance, the network of internal champions and expert wizards to spread knowledge rather than the formal top-down communication that you might expect. You'd have people within the organization who are knowledgeable, who have got a history in a sense of what their own users help them do responsibly, and help them explain to others then how to replicate that, so that you end up, I think, with the kind of steps towards a broad compliance that everyone can buy into. That would be helpful, because I could see of anyone in an organization of whatever size just doing their own thing with whatever tool they like is not a good idea at all. And that isn't unique to this. We've had that kind of conversation in decades past about software. I remember when Hotmail first came out and Microsoft Network first came out, the arguments in organizations, and indeed the one I worked for at the time, was like, you're not allowed to use this on your company laptop, so you use it on your own. Stuff like that. That's definitely not a good thing. And so you need to act to address issues like that, so that people trust you and respect you and are willing to follow a restriction as you might see it, a behavior change, if you like. That would help. So it is interesting, the learning you can get from BBVA's example, even though you are not an organization of that size with a budget to match. So it is a lot about education. It's trusting employees, absolutely, as you pointed out, Shel. But I think that's a two-way street. You need to have some kind of a quid pro quo here, that if you have these freedoms to use whatever you want, you need to do it responsibly. And here are some of the things that you need to do responsibly. Share your learnings with others in the organization, things like that. So to me, that seems like a really good place for communicators to be.
Yeah, there's communication happening in BBVA. They have 11,000 active users and 4,800 custom tools being used by those folks. That didn't happen because the communications department posted an article about them. This was peers talking to their peers about what was working for them, right? So it validates something that you and I have been talking about for years, which is that authentic lateral employee-to-employee storytelling beats top-down cascades every time. But it is communication, and why wouldn't that be something that the internal communications department jumped on and helped to not only help to facilitate, providing the channels for that rather than, the sneaker net that's probably happening now, but also because they're engaged and trying to keep this from happening below the surface, to be able to identify those use cases that are worth taking to leadership. I mean, the Black Fog survey that you referenced found that almost 70% of C-suite executives believe speed is more important than privacy or security. So if people are getting things done faster, if you can demonstrate that there actually is this productivity improvement happening, and it's because of the tools that employees are using that aren't approved, I think that's motivation for leadership to look at either approving those tools or finding ways to allow people to use their own accounts while protecting the integrity of their data.
Yeah. I think the results Harvard Business Review reports from BBVA are worth noting, even though the scale is not like many companies would experience. But they talk about 80% of usage of the system they set up coming through direct chat prompting, and the remaining 20% through employee-created GPTs. So they created their own GPTs. Now, this is not shadow AI. This was part of the process on the rollout of what they did. But these numbers are quite impressive. Over 83% of employees now use the system every week, averaging 50 prompts per week. That's above comparable enterprise deployment, says the review, quoting OpenAI. Users report an average time saving of 2 to 5 hours per week. There's a number worth noting. More than 4,800 custom GPTs have been created internally and are used 3 times more frequently than the enterprise average. So they're ahead of the game in that regard. And it goes into some more detail about which departments are more active than others, and so forth. So it actually also prompted a thought in my mind that the other surveys that I've seen and other reporting on the resistance to enabling this by leaderships in organizations isn't minor. It's not a little thing. It happens, unfortunately, too frequently. And I'm thinking indeed in terms of organizations I think we've talked about on FIR. We've certainly seen it reported. Keystroke logging, for instance, on employee usage, all that kind of stuff, auditing their computers surreptitiously, covertly, without telling them that they're watching what apps they've got installed. And indeed, probably more common, your company laptop refusing to install an app that's not on an approved list and then reporting to IT that you tried to install it, stuff like that. I mean, this is dreadful, the situation in organizations. That's common. But we're going to see more of it, I think, because that seems to be the way of the world these days on distrust. And this is a diminished trust environment we're talking about. So in all of that, where do we sit in terms of enabling stuff like this? Because we can see the advantages of allowing employees to use tools like this. I think the better way is try to do something that is within the kind of framework of the organization, not, sure, go ahead and use your own version of ChatGPT whenever you want on any device, no big deal. I wouldn't be keen on that. I wouldn't stop it. I would look at ways of weaning people off that approach. We have to help them and encourage them to do this. And that, I suspect, is a hard task for communicators to persuade leadership to do that if the climate in an organization is resistant to it anyway.
Well, I think it is a hard sell to leadership, but we have data. We're supposed to be engaging in two-way communication and facilitating two-way communication. And one of the roles of internal comms is listening. And it doesn't have to be through direct, information that you get from people through focus groups or surveys or what have you. It could be, this Black Fog survey. I mean, when 49% of employees are using unsanctioned tools and 63% think that's fine as long as there's no approved option for what it is that you want to do, you may look at that as rogue behavior, but you can also look at it as market research. And communicators are the people in the best position to translate that data into something actionable for leadership. You take that to leadership and say, look, this is what's happening. We're the ones who can interpret what the behavior means and pass that along to leadership. So I think part of our role is that listening through the data that's already out there and maybe what we can determine is going on in our organizations, and take that to leadership and say, look, this isn't going to go away if you crack down on it. It's not going to go away if you block installation on company laptops. People have their own phones. People have their own laptops and tablets. This is going to continue and this isn't new.
No,
I remember, this is going back to the earliest days of computers, and I think I've mentioned this maybe once or twice on the show, but I needed to produce charts and graphs in, like the mid 80s. And I wanted to use Harvard graphics because somebody had shown it to me and it was what worked.
Yeah.
And the company had a different program that was terrible. I just used Harvard graphics. I bought my own copy and installed it. There were no blocks back then. You put the floppy disks in the drives and it installed. So, people are going to do what they need to do to get the job done. And maybe some will pay attention to what the official rules are. Yeah. But I think the governance needs to be flexible enough to adapt to this. I applaud BBVA for what they did. Again, I don't think every organization is in a position to replicate what they did, but I think you can take lessons from what they did.
You can. Not every organization can roll out what they rolled out, enterprise licenses and so forth and so on. But some of the things they went about and how they went about it, definitely. One thing the review article points out quite strongly, and it's a very, very good thing that they do, they say towards the end in their conclusions, in whatever you do, there must be a hard human in the loop role. A human employee should always own the work. There should not be direct rights to core systems. Internal GPTs need quality scores and guardrails. They specify scope and context, include samples, etc., etc. This is simple, scalable, and non-bureaucratic. So that's something where it kind of ties back into this kind of emerging phrase, if it is even emerging, of AI, of human-centered AI, where let's look carefully at this. It's about people first, technology second, and the human needs to be in the loop. The hard human, as the review calls it, I interpret that as meaning someone who's actually cognizant, aware, able to act upon things that matter, to keep humans in the loop, to own the work, not the technology. So you've got to think about things like that. And I think for communicators, that's an important aspect of what they do, having in mind that element, that it's about the people first. So when you're trying to persuade leaders to take a course of action that you're recommending, this needs to be in your mind too, that the humans need to be in control. I have to say that this is great, and I love stories like this and examples like this. I love them more than the ones that talk about disasters, although they're useful to know about as well. Yet I feel as communicators, we've got a constant task on our hands to explain this to people in organizations, to help others understand. And I think this is a good example, the shadow AI element. For me, if I were actively involved in an organization as the communications person, I'd be looking at how do I persuade people not to do that? How do I persuade people to use the approved stuff? But at the same time, how do I persuade the leaders to make sure they offer employees stuff that actually works, that is in line with their expectation, all that kind of stuff. So it's a bit of a job in their hands. Yeah. And if budgets get in the way and other things like that, then you've got an even harder job. But hey, that's what we're here for. That's part of what we have to do. These are good examples you can learn from, and there are elements you can start. And I think, like most things, Shel, I think you need to say, okay, fine, this idea has got like a dozen constituent elements, and let's just start with 2. So we don't try and think, oh my God, this is a massive project. How on earth can we do this? You look at just a couple of the things. I like another point the Harvard Business Review states as well. Ensure that managers know what they're doing. You can't expect managers to be persuasive in encouraging others to use AI if they're not good at it themselves. And there's another element that you need to train them well, says the Harvard Review. At a minimum, they should learn how to write staffing notes, sensitive communications, and KPI reviews with AI help. So there's some things you could do straight away as a communicator in an organization. So I would say good luck and Godspeed, and it'll all work out in the end.
Yeah, manager's role in all of this is probably an episode in its own right.
Yeah.
And I would just reiterate the point you made about the human in the loop. This is a governance element that should be overarching, not applying to shadow AI, but to all use of AI in the organization, and should be a primary consideration in governance, not to turn things over to AI. Otherwise, you end up with citations that are fake going out to clients that paid $1 million for your work, right?
Yeah, not good. You're listening, Deloitte. Not
another
good.
little slap on Deloitte's wrists. And that will be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.